Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is Ukraine War News Update, first part thereof for the 10th of April 2024. Thanks for joining me here for the Ukraine news. Sorry I'm a little bit later than I'd like to be. It's the Easter holidays for my children still. We'll go to where we normally start. Ukrainian General Staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. All the usual caveats apply, and you can find them in the description to this video, found below. 830 personnel is where we've seen it for the last 2 or 3 days. Fairly hefty. 22 tanks is a phenomenal number. 47 armoured personnel vehicles is a phenomenal number. 18 artillery systems is actually less than we've seen recently. Fewer of those systems taken out, but still going to hurt the Russians. But yeah, 22 tanks. Of course, you must remember that some of these tanks will be damaged and will be recovered and able to be fixed up and sent back in. So it's not that these are always figures that represent irretrievable losses. But still, 22 tanks in one day and 47 APVs. It just shows you that the Russians are really pressing in a number of places. And those places are the ones we've heard from a lot. So you've got Bakhmut around Chasiv Yar. You've got Avdiivka down towards the south, around Tonyenka to the west of there, and indeed up in Berdichi as well, and north Novokonyovo around Avdiivka. Then you've got Novomykhailivka, but we've also got Krasnohorivka back on in the news again for the last couple of days. Some massive attacks by the Russians around that settlement. Another 67 vehicles and fuel tanks taken out. That's huge, and 8 pieces of special equipment. This is another very difficult day for the Russians, but they are making grinding territorial gains in a number of places as a result of this kind of huge mechanistic sacrifice. Andrew Perpetua doesn't have his list out yet, but I can say that there's an interesting snippet from his live stream last night that I'm going to play you.
So I bought high-res imagery of Tonenka. And in this high-res imagery, I counted 91 destroyed vehicles. Or, well, actually counted 98. Seven, I believe, were definitely Ukraine. And then there were 91 in kind of this middle area, right? It's all these green eyeballs, basically. And of those 91, not all of them are Russian. I know, like on Telegram, like everyone wants to say they're all Russian, but they're not all Russian. They're mostly Russian now. Of those 91, a few of them are Ukrainian. Like there's like a BMP-1 over there, and then there's like a T-64 somewhere. Like there's I think this is a Ukrainian BMP that was abandoned, and then there's Ukrainian tank there, and something else Ukrainian there. Uh, so I think like 6 of them or something like that were Ukrainian, and like the other like 86 or whatever, or 85 or whatever it was.
So that is just to reiterate there. I'm not sure how you include the first 7 years talking about. I don't know where they are, or what's going on there, but just from the 91 vehicles, you have 6 Ukrainian and 85 Russian vehicles. 85-6 ratio. That is absolutely stunning.
Or Russian. The image is from April 6th, so we don't have anything from the 7th or 8th or today. But that's cool, I guess. Most of the big attacks appeared to be before the 6th, so we have like all the major attacks we've seen. So any major attack, although I heard there may have been an attack today, another big attack. I think they kind of like took a few days off and then had another big one today, but obviously we don't have that because the image is too old. So yeah, that's just kind of that. So 90. So let's call it 86. 86 losses, or 85, and let's call it 85. 85 losses over the course of like what was it, like 4 days? It's crazy.
Just that one place on the map, Tonyenka, one small village, 85 confirmed, geolocated to within a meter using high resolution imagery. 85 losses for the Russians in 4 days. One tiny location. When we go back to wondering whether these figures are somewhat accurate, the answer is yes, they are. The Russians are losing immense amount of stuff. Now, the Ukrainians are losing some things, but those kind of ratios are definitely in favor of Ukraine. If Ukraine can maintain those kind of ratios largely across the front line, then ceding territory for those losses is in Ukraine's best interest. As in, ideally, the Russians will lose those without taking territory, but it's a fair compromise there. Yep, we'll give you some of this territory, we'll give you these fields and these villages if you're going to lose this amount of equipment, because a year later, you're going to be in an awful lot of trouble. Of course, we don't know how many personnel losses the Ukrainians are taking. That's the key statistic, really. Jack Detch here saying more than 2/3 of Russian tanks that Ukraine's military has destroyed in recent months have been taken out using first-person view drones. Officials tell Foreign Policy. It's a sign of Kiev's reliance on drones as it awaits more artillery and ammo from US and Europe. And this is exactly true. It's not ideal. In fact, there was a massive set of attacks from onto Krasnohorivka over the last 2 days. And though they've got a bit of a foothold in Krasnohorivka now, it appears, the Russians, you could argue that they could have destroyed that those columns, and they did give them a right good hammering, but completely taken them out if they had a massive artillery hammering the columns a couple of kilometers further back than they were. So I think there's an amount of the amount of ammunition that they have at the moment is hampering them massively, even though they appear to be using a bit more in certain places. It's not completely consistent across the front line. Andrew Perpetua is talking about how, it isn't the case that they've received the Czech ammo yet. It's that they're using up reserves, I think, stockpiles. But it's they're giving larger proportions of those stockpiles to certain areas, and other areas are still not getting any, or maybe even less, because they're giving more to certain areas. I presume places like Avdiivka, Krasnohorivka, Chasiv Yar, and whatnot. But interesting, although we know it, the drones are doing that much work. Here's a video released by the SBU, of recently destroyed air defense systems. We've seen these clocked up on the general staff figures. There's one MLRS today, but no anti-aircraft warfare systems. The last week there has been a number of these. Well, here's a video showing 2 Buk systems, 2 Tor M2 systems, and a Strela 10 short-range anti-aircraft warfare system, and a Tunguska anti-aircraft gun. So there's 6 systems in one short video there. You can check that out. And there's another one here of I think it's a further Buk, a different bit of footage though, but I may be wrong. It might have just been extracted from the other one. So interesting. Someone says Switchblade and Warmate have different interfaces. So so that's not relevant to anything other than we're going to have a little look at American provided drones, because there's a bit of a critical article that's come out to say that the American drones, not actually the Switchblades, but other sort of FPV drones that America has provided, have not been very good. And it's an interesting scenario where I think the US is going to be learning an awful lot from this war, and you'll start seeing a change in how they procure things, what they procure, and what they learn from the front lines in Ukraine. Here, the Russian are now. This is something he's doing a lot of rounds yesterday. So there's this armored assault into Krasnohorivka. Let's go and have a look at it here. Yep, a bit of music. Everyone loves a bit of music, don't they, this time in the morning? So we have this armored assault that comes in, and if you see at the front there, there's this. Some people are calling it the tortoise. It's this completely covered over tank, actually. Andrew Perpetua is saying because you can't really foresee that tank moving its turret. The understanding is the turret was probably broken. He says actually this is relatively common. Turrets, there are so many moving parts in the turret, as you can imagine. Damaged, when vehicles get damaged through shelling or IEDs, mines, drones, whatnot, they there are certain elements of the tank that are going to be vulnerable to being taken out, and the turret is obviously one of them. This is possibly a tank with a broken turret that they turn into this tortoise thing, and it did an attack on Krasnohorivka and appears to have survived. And we know it survived because it was later blown up in a strike on that on the place where it was made in behind. I forget what the town is behind Krasnohorivka. And so actually there is, I should have dug out the footage for you, but there is footage of that building with that underneath it getting destroyed. I don't know, it's not in there, unfortunately. So anyway, it shows, well, the question is, what's going on here? What's the context for this? And I would suggest that they would only do something like this if they, because this is being used as an armored personnel carrier. You can basically get underneath the metal of that. I'm going to find a video. Okay, so here we go. So this is the video of the place that it was being stored in, being hit. I think the place it was actually built. So here is the remains of that building. You can see there's some fairly substantial destruction going on, and that's a vehicle. You can see all the metal from the sides of it flayed and in a lot of trouble there. So one can assume that's that vehicle taken out. Then this is it in a nice, better close up there. So you can really see the tank turret poking out the front of it, and that's what it looked like close up. So here's a video of the vehicle in its home environment, if you like. You can see the tank turret sticking out of the front, and then as we go to the back of the vehicle, passing its side there, you can see that it's one just big armored hulk. Look, particularly strong armor though, to be perfectly frank. It is essentially being used, as far as I can work out, as a glorified MTLB, some glorified kind of armor personnel carrier. It's just you put a load of men in there, you send it to the front, and hopefully it gets there because it's somewhat protected, and then your troops alight, and it turns around and goes home. So the question, as I was saying, is why? What's going on here? Why don't you use an MTLB? Why don't you use an armored personnel carrier full of people that should surely better protect, or is like at least designed for that and is more maneuverable? And the only feasible answer, plausible answer, is that this is what they have. Like, they are struggling to get hold of vehicles. So when we ask the question, are the Russians running out? This is an indication that they are struggling, at least in some places. This to me is not an ideal scenario. You've got a tank that can't use its turrets. So A, it's not being fixed. So why is it not being fixed? So it can act as a tank. And two, it's being plastered with a load of crappy armor so that you can whack a load of people in it like you would an APC. Why are you not using an APC? This shows that there is some kind of lacking going on with the Russians. Right, moving on, we have initially there was a claim that this was a KA attack, KA-27. That was what the rumours were to begin with. Here it was, sorry. A Russian shipborne helicopter, the KA-27, was destroyed in occupied Crimea, speak of the Ukrainian naval forces, minus a Russian KA-27 in Crimea looking for something. It found it. That was what was written. And that was reported in several places. But now we are hearing that a Mi-24, and the Russians have admitted this, has been lost in Chornomorska area of northwestern Crimea. The crew died. I presume that's the same helicopter. I presume it wasn't a Ka-27 and it was a Mi 24 or similar. So it crashed off the coast of Russian-occupied Crimea. The Mi-24 Crocodile attack helicopter has crashed near the western coast of Crimea. According to the Russian Defense Ministry, according to the preliminary data, the accident was caused by a technical problem. Nothing has been reported about the fate of the crew. There's extensive reporting that it was shot down by friendly fire. Don't know at all which of those theses is correct. Could have been a technical problem, could have been friendly fire. There could be two helicopters. At least one helicopter, probably just one helicopter, has been lost off the coast of Crimea. And the final part in this hits and losses video is another use of the hammer. Now, these are going to be used quite a bit, I would have thought, at the moment. So I'm not going to show you all the footage, but this is an AASM 250 hammer. So the French provided guided glide bomb hitting the location of a Russian military base in the village of Yakovlivka in Donetsk. That, I think, is significant. I think Yakovlivka is just north of Bakhmut, if it's that one. These are really effective bombs, actually, and it's great to see Ukraine using them and getting hold of them. The French are providing 50 per month, up to 600 over the course of the year. I don't know what they'll do beyond that, or whether they'll up production and provision of them at all. But they are certainly very useful for the Ukrainians in at least some kind of answer to the Russian usage of their own guided glide bombs. But the Russian use of those bombs needs to be halted by the Ukrainians, absolutely. Right, moving on to distance munitions and standoff munitions and strikes. Russia again has hit the energy and transport infrastructure of Ukraine. 14 out of 17 Shaheeds were shot down. So it's an okay interception rate. Fewer Shaheeds, 3 out of 17. I don't know what the percentage is. Unsurprisingly, there's the 2 Iskander-K cruise missiles and 1 Iskander-M ballistic missiles. So ballistic missiles, especially Iskander-M, Ukrainians really struggled to shoot down. 2 Kh-59s have been shot down by the Ukrainians, though. So out of the 5 missiles sent, 2 were shot down. I don't know if that was just overnight, because it was quite active yesterday as well. Indeed, yesterday there were attacks on Kharkiv, Odessa, Poltava. Odessa seems to be, at the moment, quite a big target for the Russians. They're hammering Odessa on consecutive days. And it's an absolute shame, because it's a beautiful, historic city, culturally iconic city, Odessa. And Russia is just attempting to reduce it to rubble like they are to Kharkiv. It's criminal, literally. Odessa region was struck by missiles, possibly Kh-59. The Southern Defense Forces report. Air Defense Forces destroyed 2 missiles over the sea. However, there was a hit on the open territory of an infrastructure facility. Administrative and technical premises were damaged. No people were injured. Russia attacks energy infrastructure in Odessa and Mykolaiv oblasts. Russia carried out an overnight attack on energy infrastructure in Odessa and Mykolaiv oblasts, according to the Southern Defense Force. It is really challenging all over Ukraine at the moment. This is Konstantinivka. Now, I don't know whether this is the one up behind Bakhmut or the one behind, is it Novomykolivka? Because, Ukraine, they have the same name places. But this is this is a town near the front line, and this is what happens to it. And look at it. People are still trying to live there. This is the wide-scale destruction that the Russians are delivering to these civilian places that they eventually, one would think, are, attempting to liberate. This is what liberation looks like. It looks rather like overt destruction to me. But there you go. And moving on, Lloyd Austin says Ukraine's attacks on Russian oil could threaten the global energy market. US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin warned that recent Ukrainian attacks targeting Russian oil refineries could have a knock-on effect on the global energy market, according to Bloomberg. There's lots of talks about him slamming the Ukrainian use of missiles on energy infrastructure within Russia. I don't know whether it was slammed. I don't know whether this is just rhetorical devices used by media outlets. However, lots of people are reacting very negatively to the American criticism of strikes on Russian energy infrastructure when Russia just spend every night doing that to Ukraine. Um, as Tordara Iverson here says, I can see where the administration's concerns are coming from, but I think they're wrong, and this position makes the US look bad too, considering the current state of the war. If you want to change in targets, as an example, give Ukraine proper tools to go after air bases. So don't say you can't hit these oil refineries when that's like one of the few places that Ukraine practically can hit. The airbase is going to be much better protected by air defenses. Like if you are really big on them not hitting that, then how about, I know you have provided some presidential drawdown authority, but essentially you've provided little to no um, assistance for 6 months because of Congress, because of Marjorie Taylor Greene, etc., etc. It's very easy to criticize from that position, but it's kind of double standards, or at least it's a bit disingenuous to make those criticisms without providing them the alternative to do something else that you do want them to do. So I think that's a really valid point there. Jakub Janowski from Oryx says, in my opinion, if the US wants Ukraine to switch to other targets, it needs to 1, provide proper ongoing military support to Ukraine, 2, give Ukraine missiles and permission to use those missiles for attacks against other Russian assets, like air bases used by Russian aircraft to attack Ukraine. That's so important. And 3, crack down on the Russian ability to bypass oil price ceilings. Anything less is idiotic nonsense. And I would generally agree. I don't know whether he feels like he has to say these things, whether these are political statements, but I don't think it helps at all. And I don't know if these kind of statements are being made to a particular audience, whether it's to the Russian audience, whether this is signaling stuff to Putin, or I don't know, maybe to a domestic MAGA audience, or who knows. I was in conversation with Jonathan Fink recently from Silicon Curtain. He said he had been speaking to some people fairly high up with connections that was saying it's not so much the economic argument, it's the escalation argument. It might be dressed up here as economic argument, but it could well be that escalation is what's actually driving this kind of rhetoric. Interesting. So moving on, this has done the rounds. So there was a hit on a large warehouse, or large enough warehouse, of Ukrainian howitzers. Now, it's really weird here. So Russia struck 32 Ukrainian D-20 howitzers that were in storage with an Iskander-M missile, so this is a ballistic missile, near Zalizhny in Sumy Oblast, 40 kilometers from Russia. And this is actually an area that Russia had got to, I think, when they had invaded. So I think they knew it was there. They'd been there. The Russians are making a lot of this, and then there's a lot of pushback from Ukrainians. And I think the pushback is warranted because these have not moved since 2017. Broadly speaking, I think there are some claims that some of them have been there is a slight difference in storage numbers. If you want to count them, be my guess. I saw 43 on the latest imagery pre-strike, and now 32. I don't know. The idea, though, is that if Ukraine have been screaming out for artillery, absolutely screaming out for artillery, since the beginning of this war, and we've got a warehouse full of howitzers that hasn't moved in 7 years, then I think these are not needed. For some reason these are not needed. They're either not in working order, or they're waiting to be cannibalized, or for some reason can't be cannibalized, or something. But it seems fairly obvious to me that these old D-20 howitzers, these are old bits of kit, right, are excess to requirements. There's no way they'd be sitting there not being used if they could be. Although the flip side to that is, listen to Paul Conroy, the photojournalist and former gunner himself. Incidentally, I'm going to be interviewing him soon. I'm dead excited about that. It's going to be fascinating, that one. So he was in Kherson, and he was interviewed by Times recently, and he's saying that he met a mortar crew that have found an old D-20 or something like that without any wheels, and they found some wheels for it, and then they found a site for it, then they learned how to fire it on YouTube. And so if there are situations like that where there are people who are scrabbling together and rebuilding howitzers down in near Kherson, then you know, when they could surely use one, even though it's a crappy old howitzer, if there's one, if there are 30 of these back in a warehouse that's subsequently been blown up, then okay, that's a bit weird. But anyway, in general, like, these can't be that important if they've sat there untouched, and they were untouched while the Russians themselves were around there too. So, right, moving on. But you'll see that that is being shouted about quite a lot at the moment. We go to other bits and pieces. So these are the floods that are so widespread in Russia at the moment. Russia is now facing its own Dnipro disaster after several dam breaches. The water level of the Ural River in Orenburg has exceeded the 10-meter mark. Lots of residential areas are flooded, leaving tens of thousands homeless. Hundreds of thousands have been evacuated already. This is a massive disaster. Meanwhile, Orenburg went underwater. Emergency evacuation is underway. Tjumen, it will also flood in the near future. This is some footage from the Russian media. You can see how widespread the flooding is. This is a big old problem, and it will be costing the Russians dearly, financially speaking, and in terms of social costs too. Indeed, well, before we go on to social costs, another claim: due to the flooding in Orsk, the missile warning system station Voronezh M radar has stopped its work, and there is a threat of flooding. Russian Telegram channel sources report. According to the interlocutor, the shutdown of the Voronezh M radar in Orsk station is located 20 kilometers from the old city near the village of Kumak. It has caused problems in tracking the launches of intercontinental ballistic missiles from this southern direction. Due to the breach of dams, the threat of complete flooding of the Voronezh radar is very high. If this happens, it will not be possible to restore the radar hull quickly. It will take at least several years. So nature could be coming to the aid of the Ukrainians to some degree, as dams are high, flooding is taking place, and things are not looking good. Now, this is translating into some discontent here. So I'm just going to read you this. Residents of flooded Russian Orsk are toying with separatist ideas, says Anton Grishchenko. They're furious that so many resources were given to Crimea when it was occupied and they got none. Of course, Crimea was the jewel in the crown for the Russians from 2014 onwards and appears to have received a lot of funding. They were short on water themselves and had all sorts of work done to try and get the water, which is why they went straight for Kherson after the start of the war to try and get water rediverted from the Dnipro River back down to Crimea. Why the F do people who have no housing left have to shell out money for pillows? And there's no water, he extols. They could have easily made a temporary overpass. When Crimea was annexed, they made effing overpass for water, but not for us. They want Crimea? We can succeed now. We help everyone but ourselves. I don't understand why, and we'll keep silent till the end, but the Regional Ministry of Emergency Situation writes that they're effed. As in, I'm presuming not enough money, not enough equipment. But Orsk is doing fine. Everything is okay. I mean, here is someone who's not very happy at all. And that's exactly the sort of discontent Ukrainians would be very happy to see on a much more regular basis. But Ukraine has its own problems, huge problems with electricity, and the success that the Russians have had in hitting Ukrainian electricity infrastructure. They've dramatically increased its imports, and they had got to a point where they had been exporting, the Ukrainians, and that has just flipped, spun on a sixpence there to be now importing heavily because they've been hammered. Recent Russian attacks on its energy infrastructure have caused the exports to stop around each hit. So you got a hit there, back here at the beginning. Let's have a look at that. So that was on the 22nd of March. That was a big one, if you remember, 22nd of March. Huge. That's probably the biggest one, and that's the massive jump in imports and a downward trend in exports. And then another peak up here, another peak. They are just really struggling at the moment for for energy. The Ukrainians they're rolling blackouts going on. Kharkiv is still doesn't have consistent power. It's just a bit of a nightmare. I'm going to dip into this opinion here from Jean-Yves Le Drian, a former minister of the armed forces in France. Quote, who would have predicted that Ukraine would resist so well and that the Kremlin special operation would be a failure? Let's not forget that the Russian soldiers who entered Ukraine from Belarus were carrying their parade uniforms. They planned to march on Kiev a few days later. The Russian failure is due to several errors of judgment on Putin's part. First, an underestimation of the Ukrainian resistance and the strength of national feeling in that country. Then, an underestimation of the unity of the Europeans, which has never been denied in action. Putin failed to see that the invasion of Ukraine would bring NATO and within NATO the United States back into the game. Ultimately, Putin overestimated the strength of his army. He suffered bitter failures and even humiliations. The destruction of the cruiser Moskva, the attacks of the Kerch Bridge in Crimea, and the withdrawal of the Black Sea Fleet. You will have understood that I'm not one of those who accompany doubts, especially because Russia feeds on doubts. It perpetuates them and fuels them. The capture of Avdiivka, designed to give Putin a victory before the elections, is not a breakthrough, but a nibble. We often speak of Russia's strategic depth. It should not be overestimated. The Russians are struggling to mobilize, and they're also lagging behind in technological terms because of the Western sanctions. Everyone understands that Ukraine cannot and must not lose. It is now important that this awareness is translated into increased support for Ukraine, whatever the outcome of the US elections. Europe must ensure that its military production tools can meet demand, especially when it comes to ammunition and artillery. This is an essential industrial meeting. It will only be possible with adequate funding. I support the Estonian Prime Minister's proposal to mobilize a loan of €100 billion to enable Europeans to meet the challenge. Interesting stuff there, and very positive. So that's just to give you the other side of the coin, that though Ukraine are really struggling in many ways, actually they have managed to hold off the Russians for 2 years, and the Russians are, when they are getting their big successes, the perspective needs to be recognized, which is that it is a mere nibble taking Avdiivka and at tremendous cost to the Russian. So, I'm up and down at the moment. There's a positive idea of how things have gone. And we do forget the successes that the Ukrainians have had. The Kerch Bridge being destroyed, the sinking of the Moskva, so on and so forth. But there you go. Let me know what you think. Anyway, I'll get on with my next video. You take care. Speak to you soon.